who would you like to speak about tonight? Because you're like the resident expert on British soldiers who fought in the, what would you call it, the American Revolution and the American British Indian Wars um, over
Yeah,
there.
so the gentlemen I'll be discussing tonight, plural there of gentlemen, if I get round to it. We'll see how fast we can go, we'll see how much we can cover. But are going to be British officers who fought during the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. So 7 Years' War is often the term used to describe the entire conflict, including what happened in Europe and what happened in North America, whereas French and Indian War is typically used just about the North American theater, and that's why here in America we typically say French and Indian War, whereas in Britain it is typically called 7 Years, but they're both the same conflict. And first up, I would like to clarify, it's very common in the popular imagination for the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, to be treated as a kind of prologue or prequel type of thing to the American Revolution. But I think it's important to remember that the people who were involved in this war did not obviously see it that way. This conflict had its own dynamics, it had its own integrity, etc. It was not contingent, upon the American Revolution, even though certain aspects of it did lead into what happened later. It still should be treated as its own war, and the people who fought in it obviously should be treated as heroes of their own war, and not always overshadowed by the American Revolution, I think. So to start off with, I'd like to begin with General Edward Braddock. And so there's a little bit of debate about whether Braddock was Scottish or English, because there's dispute about whether he was born in either Perthshire in Scotland or in London, England, and what his family background was exactly on each side of the family. But one thing we know about him certainly is that he was British. So I think it's safe to say he comes from a military background. And so therefore that could have been another reason he may have been born in Scotland while having an English ancestral background. And he has a very Anglo-Saxon name. Braddock means broad oak, and it fits his personality. He's a very stubborn, stalwart fellow. Everybody knew him for that. And that could be a good and a bad thing, in terms of him being both very brave, but also sometimes being a bit stuck in his ways and, just a bit stubborn. So he enters into the British military in his father's regiments at the tender age of 15, and he serves for more than 40 years in times of war and peace. He's a part of the War of Austrian Succession, and he rises through the ranks in various capacities. By the time he becomes quite famous in the French and Indian War, he is 60 years old. He's been through a lot. He's a long-term veteran, but he's being sent now to a region he's never been to before in North America, because troubles have started, territorial disputes with the French in North America. So there's a story that's told. Braddock, he had a lady friend, a young actress, shall we say, and she ends up writing this sort of memoir as someone after Braddock's death, when she did a little bit of a tell-all memoir, but some of the things she had to say were interesting. And one of those things was that she said that he told her he was very concerned about this expedition, and he sort of unfolded a map in front of her, and it's like, look at this, they expect me to go out there into this practically uncharted area and sort of pave a path and take the war to the French and take down these French forts, and particularly Fort Duquesne. And he was feeling concerned about it, and according to her, he was telling her, I don't expect me to come back, Georgianne. And so it was a bit sad and a bit concerning, obviously, for him. So he wasn't super convinced that he was ready for this. But when he gets to North America, he puts on the sort of stalwart bravado he's famous for, and he's saying, okay, you know what, I'm gonna just act like I know what I'm doing here completely, and have confidence in the organization and the training of British arms, which was something of course he'd been in since his teens. So Braddock, his role is to go and take again Fort Duquesne from the French, and so he has to go on Braddock's March, is what it becomes known as, this advance through what is now, well, what was then as well Pennsylvania, but it was then a colony of Pennsylvania, British colony of Pennsylvania. And so he ends up with, as his aide, a young George Washington, who, of course, at this point is a loyal subject of the king and the mother country and all the rest of it, but has been having a bit of a hard time of it because of the debacle that occurred at Fort Necessity. And earlier than that, essentially a young Washington in charge of his Virginia militia opened fire on a French delegation party, kind of generating the war in some ways, or at least really, even though the war was brewing anyway, he really kind of set it into motion. He lost control of some of his Indian allies who ended up murdering the emissary from the French. And this started a whole bunch of stuff. Then he built a fort in a valley, Fort Necessity, which got taken down, and it was just a disaster. So he had been put on the bench, suffice to say. This is when he's in his 20s. It's, so he's out to the bench. He goes and volunteers himself to Braddock. He wants to get back in the show, back in the saddle again. And Braddock says, I like this kid. He's got spunk. He's a little bit annoying, but he's got spunk. And so he goes against even the royal governor in order to get Washington off the bench and take him onto his staff. And they have a very fascinating relationship. It's one of, in my opinion, a tough love paternalism. That, Braddock basically becomes his mentor. He's tough on Washington. But the thing is, Braddock was a tough guy. Like, that was just the way he presented himself. It's just about everyone. Some people found him very cantankerous and rude and the rest of it. But if he cared about you, he really would be helpful to you. And he really would give you his, knowledge and his veteran ability. He would try to pass that on to you. And that's what he did with Washington. He really took the kid under his wing and took him on. And
so you're talking about George Washington. You said George Washington there.
So Edward Braddock taking on a young George Washington under his wing and mentoring him. And so he gives him a sort of tough love. On the one hand, he kind of hollers at the kid a lot. But on the other hand, he really is trying to teach him, and he really is trying to hone something he sees in him. He sees some talent enough he sees spunk, he sees spark enough to, again, go up against opposition in order to get this kid on his staff and to really try to bring out what he believed was best and most useful in this kid.
It's just sorry to interrupt, but it's interesting, therefore, that this is the future founder of America, George Washington, if you want to call him that, at least the first official president, or at least the president that they date the number 47th from, even though there was presidents before George Washington that are unnumbered for some reason. But this is a George Washington basically being part of the British Army, getting his career started as fighting for the crown, basically.
Oh, yes, very much so. I mean, I think everyone should, remember that. I mean, if you read through the letters of George Washington at this age, this time, he isn't just a royalist. He's an uber royalist. He's a very, very gushy royalist. He's very eager to prove himself, to make connections, to mesh in, with the British establishment. And he was dealing, it was a combination of things. Yes, there were prejudices against colonials that he was trying to kind of challenge and contest and try to get ahead, because he wanted, a commission in the regular British Army. But it was very, very hard for colonials to do that because, again, prejudice against colonials. At the same time, he had to overcome his own issues. And this is the thing I would say about this part of the history. Washington sometimes made it a bit too much like it was only colonial prejudice, when in reality, Washington's early career was all over the place. And so at times when people were saying, well, no, you're not getting a promotion, it was because of things Washington himself did. So it wasn't solely the colonial thing, but it was an age of the class system. So you had prejudices, whether they, not just in terms of class, but in terms of location in the empire, in terms of religion. We've talked a lot about that with regards to my story, my trilogy, All Ye That Pass By, which deals with a Catholic trying to do things. So there was all form racial prejudice. It's just the way it was. as frankly in different ways we have in all eras of history. It's just part of human reality that prejudices come up and so forth. So that was the thing, but there were other elements. It wasn't solely prejudice, and I think sometimes when the story gets retold, we tell it solely from, I think, the way Washington saw things, and not always from a wider perspective. That yes, while he was dealing with certain prejudices, no question about that, he still did make his own errors, and some of the people around him were actually, and this is sort of part of this, what happens with Braddock. They actually were trying to help him. This was the case with Braddock. He was trying to mentor him. He was trying to be paternal toward him, really. And you have these wonderful some of these wonderful little stories, where in one case, Washington gets really sick, and so he basically had a combination of like fever and dysentery, and it was just all kinds of nasty stuff you get on the trail. And so Braddock, in a kind of brusque fashion, is like, go to bed, kid. Go to bed, seriously, like, don't spread the germs. But then he essentially tries to get Washington to take his medicine, like, just sleep. And Washington's like, but I want to be where the action is, please, I want to be where the action. And so he's like, look, all right, look, if something really, really awesome happens, I'll get them and get you to bring you up. And so Washington, in just this very little kid fashion in my mind, is sort of like, will you promise me on your word of honor? And Braddock's just like, yes, I promise you on my word of honor. Now drink your medicine. And so so they have this relationship. So fast forwarding to when everything goes to hell in a handbasket, we basically have the Battle of Monongahela, which is named after the river, the Monongahela River. And they get ambushed, and you do end up with a situation where Washington wants to be part of the action, even though he is sick and he's literally got like a pillow tied to his saddle. And Braddock is really annoyed with him and yelling at him, part yelling at him, part like threatening to bayonet him, which I don't think he was gonna do, but he was yelling at him, and then telling other aides to like, look out for this sick pup, will you? He's just making a nuisance of himself, but okay. And so what ends up happening, they get attacked, and Washington ends up as one of the only aides, I think the only aide, in fact, of Braddock, who mounted aide, like on horseback, who is not unhorsed, and who is not killed or wounded in this confrontation. It was very intense.
Who are they fighting in the Battle of
Monongahela? They're fighting the
That's a
French.
great word.
It is, isn't it? It's an awesome sounding battle, and I mean, it wasn't awesome for the people. It certainly wasn't awesome for the British and the British Americans, but it was eventful. It was eventful. So they're fighting the French, and the Indians allied with the French. So it is a territory dispute that they're having with the British Empire, French Empire, clash of empires that's happening here.
Can I just ask you, maybe, I don't know if you know this, but the Native American Indians there, I mean, what was in it for them? Were they thinking, were they trying to think that the French were going to be protecting their land, or why would the Indians choose sides in that case?
Well, they were like any other powers of the day. They made alliances. So some tribes would ally with the French, others would ally with the British, depending on what they believed was best for them, just like any other power, really. That's what they would be like. They would make those decisions based on who they thought would be a better ally, who would be better at helping them protect their lands or fight their enemies among the native tribes, access, trade. They were basically acting like every other, every other group of people in this situation. They were trying to do what they believed was best for them.
It's a good point, because I think when people tend to think of the Native Americans, we lump them all in together without realizing that, in fact, they were tribes who considered that they didn't necessarily want the other tribe coming in or taking their land, or that the other tribes had to be held at bay and things like that. There wasn't like this united all the Indians against the French, or all the Indians against the British. They had, as you just very well said there, they had their own regional tribal interests that they what, as you say, thought best protected by a particular side or another.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, it's like thinking of the tribes that made up Europe. I mean, think of all the different peoples that make up Europe. Well, it's the same thing with North America. I mean, you've got a continent worth of people and tribe. They aren't all a single monolithic group. They all have, again, their unique interests and so forth. So yeah, you get, in this case, the French allied Indians are doing the main bulk of the attack. And this is the first time, well, not the first time, that is a little strong, but this is a time that's very prominent that you get to see Indian warfare, though, on organized troops. And so what ends up happening is that the colonial militias were more accustomed to dealing with this type of fighting. So they would know, like, hey, we can't hold formation, we're going to break and scatter and hide if you're being ambushed, that kind of thing. But Braddock, he is a man who cannot change on this point. And I mean, it's because he has been trained, hammered into him from a teenager. You break your position, you die. Everyone dies around you. It's not really a fault in his training, but it's a fault in the setting. So he's very used to European battlefield situations. And he was right about that. In European battlefield situations, you break your formation, you die. Things go wrong. And so he is absolutely stuck on this, and he won't listen to Washington, who is pleading with him to let the troops break their formation. But Braddock will not hear. He will not listen. And so he insists that this is the only way to survive. And he puts his body on the line with that belief, by the way. This man is no coward. He has multiple horses shot out from under him, keeps getting up. He stands, it rides, so to say, in the middle of the melee, and is constantly exhorting and forcing his men, both regulars and colonials, to stand and to fight. Washington as well is losing multiple horses, getting bullets shot through his coat, and all of this. And Braddock then gets mortally wounded with a bullet through the lung. And this is a famous painting of the wounding of General Braddock that's just come up on the screen. And so he then falls from his horse, and Washington and several others go over to try to help him. And he famously really lives up to his Braddock reputation here by shouting at them as they're trying to take him off the field, leave me here, give me my pistol and rounds of shot, and I fight them to the end. And so the logic seemed to be that he intended to stay and fight it out till he was dead. And and so that it was just an awesome moment of just him being, again, I think the thing with Braddock is he's a wonderfully flawed hero, I think, which makes him interesting. He has these virtues and flaws that are quite mixed. Maybe one could even say all that is sort of best and worse in the traditional British character. And so that's something he wanted to fight to the end, to go down with his ship, so to speak. But his aides don't listen to him; they carry him off the field, and as he's kicking and screaming, essentially.
Did he survive that? Because we've only got 3 or 4 minutes left. But did he live to tell the tale?
He did not, sadly, because he had been mortally wounded in the lung. And so he ends up sending Washington. He says, okay, you go and you go, Washington, and you get help, And so then it takes him multiple days to die. Weirdly enough, he died on my birthday. I know this is a weird fact, but I always have this connection with him. He died on July 13th. I'm just like, birthday. So he lingered, or quite tragically, with this bullet in his lung, and he's extremely stressed. And one of the doctors said he may have died as much from the stress as from the bullet. And he was in such pain in the wagon that he kept it, and because he wanted to be seen by his men, he kept saying, get me back up on the horse, get me back up on the horse. And so they would get him up on the horse, and then he would go part-time, like on the horse and then back in the wagon, and on the horse, back in the wagon. And they finally, set him in the tent. And so he, I'm just going to try to wrap real quick.
Yes, go ahead. But there's something I want to
interject,
to ask
I just didn't want to fade away.
You have resuscitated this chap, Braddock, because you've written a 10-minute song about him.
I did, yeah.
Now it's on your YouTube
Birthday,
channel.
boy.
We'll just put up the YouTube address for you, but your 10-minute song is called Braddock's Sash,
Yes,
and
yeah.
in that picture you can see that he was wearing a sash. We'll just bring that picture back up again. He's got a sash around him, that's just presumably just like a military sash or something like that.
It is from his father, and this is what this is actually the tie-in thing. So Braddock, when he's dying, right? So he sends a message to Georgianne, his lady friend, in which he's basically like, you know, tell her I died facing the enemy and all the rest of that. And then he leaves. He calls his manservant over and speaks to him kindly and thanks him for his loyalty, and then basically says to him, hey, you've seen enough of war. Settle in America, do some farming, but go into service with Colonel Washington and serve him as well as you served me. And then Braddock goes on to will Washington that military sash that, you know, came from his father, given to him by his father upon his entry into his father's regiment. And so this was a very intimate and very paternal thing. Not only does he get that, but Braddock also gives Washington his pistols. He gives him a fancy pouch, like saddle pouch. So there's, and I think he also gets Braddock's surviving horse as well. So and Braddock asks Washington to do his eulogy. So this is all very intimate stuff going on with this, and Washington keeps these items, the sash and the pistols, throughout his life, and carries the sash around with him everywhere practically, even when he was a rebel general now at this point, and later on a president of said rebel breakaway entity. But unfortunately, Washington had some issues. I'm just going to go briefly. Washington had some issues in terms of, I feel like, not only forgiveness, but properly contextualizing father figures. This is something, and a lot of other things, but pops up later. He tends to be posthumously mad at Braddock. I'm not gonna go into great detail here, but suffice to say, he tends to talk up a bit of a game here about how much, you know, all of the flaws he saw in Braddock, to the point of annoying some of the other aides. And you had another aide who basically said, wrote Washington a letter in which he says, look, I don't know if you know this, but look, Braddock cared about you. I can't believe you didn't see this, but you were kind of his pet. I know he yelled at you a lot, but I mean, he did that when he liked you. That was his love language. You understand? He cared. He didn't really have a family. So, you know, come on, dude. Don't be like this. And he had a complicated relationship. I think it's interesting to comment on Washington in that light, that I feel like this was an aspect of his complicated relationship with Mother England. So it was like the parent type of thing was a bit complex for him, that he had this relationship, though, and I think that was the point of the song, that I wrote the song, and I made a point that even though he has this very complicated relationship both with Braddock and with England, wider Britain, of course, though he has this complex relationship, he can run, but he can't hide. It's in his blood, it's in his DNA, it's in his very essence, it's in the language on his tongue. He can't escape from his Britishness. He can't escape from the fact that Braddock was this mentoring figure that got him off the bench. That it was his courage and his determination and his guts, just really, and ultimately his skill as well. Because we forget, even when we think of, Washington gave him the advice to do irregular things, he was stuck on the regular thing. Well, the fact of the matter is, Washington needed to learn regularity and discipline too. So
well,
even
do you know what? I think we'll stop it there, because that's a perfect place to stop it. And basically what you have explained to us is that the founder of America, if you want to be dramatic about it, or at least modern, the 13
modern
colonies.
Republican government, because we want to emphasize America has a longer history than that. Exactly. I always like to say that.
Exactly. The founder of the current Republican system got his start basically by this chap Braddock, who if he had not taken this young whippersnapper in, who knows, the history of the world could actually have gone in a different direction. The history of America could have gone in a different direction. Who knows? So, in fact, Colonel Braddock is General Braddock
Get
is
him
in
up, get him up
fact
on this.
a huge influence over Washington, and a critical figure in America's past that I hitherto did not know anything about until just now. In fact, I said Colonel Braddock because
you were
Colonel
close, because
Braddock,
Colonel Washington you were thinking of, probably.
No, I wasn't thinking of him.
Oh.
I was thinking of Colonel James Braddock, which is the Chuck Norris character in the Missing in Action films.
Okay.
The three Missing in Action films, he's called Colonel James Braddock, because you said what a great name Braddock is. What a great kind of American British name. And well, obviously the script writers for Chuck Norris also thought the same thing. So it's the whole thing goes right around, and we wouldn't have had a Chuck Norris if we hadn't had a George Washington, and we wouldn't have had a George Washington if we hadn't had a General Edward Braddock. And I think
constellations go on.
Absolutely. We'll finish it on that fantastic note. If your book is All Ye That Pass By.
And he does get referenced in there. Braddock is referenced within the trilogy. Even though it focuses on the Revolution, it does have a lot of flashback stuff to the French and Indian War. So Braddock makes appearances.
Fantastic. Bringing the past into modern life. You can just search Amazon.com or Amazon.co.uk and you'll get that. Just search for All Ye That Pass By. I do say to people, listen to Avellina's song. It's a 10-minute song. You'll find it on her YouTube page, which is youtube.com/@Avellina Balestri. And for those of listening on the podcast, Avellina Balestri is AVELLINA Avellina, it's been an absolute pleasure. We'll clip this 25-minute section. We'll put it out onto the internet. Please do share it around, and let's get the history of British America better known.
A quick shout out to my friend George Bray, by the way. He's been a massive source of inspiration and research when it comes to the French and Indian War. He's a reenactor and living history, just researcher in general. He has been a wealth of information about all things French and Indian War and figures. I just want to just do a shout out to him for being awesome, for being a great friend and helper.
He sounds like an awesome bloke. Great stuff. And more, we need more people like you and him to keep the British American story alive. Avellina, it's been a pleasure as always. We'll get you back.
Thank you so much. Merry Christmas to everyone on Force for Good, and
thank you. And keep
the Union Jack flying high.
Absolutely. Merry Christmas to you and your family over there in the great formerly British colony of Maryland.
British at heart. Thank you. God bless. You have a great day. Thank you.
Good night.